If there was a single engine or mode that would propel or advance a country to have an edge over other countries, what do you think that would be? No, really, think about it. Wouldn't it be wonderful if something like that actually existed? Well, it does. It's called education. Yet there are so many people who are deprived of receiving a proper education.
It's unacceptable that 20 years into the 21st century, about 258 million children and youth do not attend school. 617 million children and adolescents cannot read and do basic math, and millions of refugees and internally displaced persons and people with disabilities are out of school.
Well, those figures are mind-boggling, yet they are the ugly statistics that shows just how bad and insufficient the people who are not receiving this education are, and how this is just happening around the world. Just think how much more advanced the world could be if all these people actually received a proper education.
Without education, we cannot achieve any of the SDGs. And yet, with the 2030 looming on the horizon, the world is lagging behind. And that is why the Secretary-General has issued a global call for a decade of action to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. The situation in education is alarming. Alarming because of the crisis in the number of children and young people and adults who are not in education. Alarming also because of the crisis in the number of children, young people and adults who are in education but not learning.
Hi, I'm Kavit Tagwe. Welcome to Economic Divide. In this week's show, we will not only take a look at education and the lack of learning around the world, but we will also look at a phenomenon known as education inequality and how both have contributed to a lack of economic advancement worldwide. First, a look at the numbers of people who have not received proper education or no education at all. About 258 million children and youth do not attend school. 617 million children and adolescents cannot read and do basic math. So, that was how many people have not received education. Now comes education inequality, which in many ways stems from poverty. For example, in the U.S., 22% of the children live at or below poverty level, in which 17 states across the country, low-income students now comprise the majority of public school students in those states. Africa, on the other hand, is a mixed bag. Even though Africa's current primary school enrollment rate is above 80% on average, it is widely accepted that Africans suffer from low-quality teaching and learning, as well as inequalities. Now, when it comes to education, what does education inequality then constitute? For example, there's unequal distribution of essential facilities, such as schools, and also the level of education offered in more affluent neighborhoods compared to lower-income neighborhoods.
The Global South is a developing area of the world, and arguably the area under control by the developed North, currently struggles to provide a viable education for children and adolescents alike. One could argue that many poorer countries around the globe have to push their children towards vocational choices rather than academic in order to work and contribute to putting food on the table. Hence, working from a very young age is the norm for some people. However, it's been argued that people that do not receive an education are 20% more likely to head into conflict, crime, or worse.
ये बच्चे गरीब गुरबा अगर पढ़ेंगे नहीं चोर बन जाएंगे, डाकू बन जाएंगे, पाकिस्तान के लिए दहशतगर्द बन जाएंगे। मैंने यही कोशिश की कि इन बच्चों को पढ़ाया जाए ताकि ये चोर ना बने, डाकू ना बने, तालीम हासिल करें, पाकिस्तान की पुलिस में जाएं, फौज में जाएं, डॉक्टर बने, इंजीनियर बने।
Many also say that they simply just do not have the facilities or teaching ability to lead education forward.
In this school, we have no accommodation, no places, no space for the student. So we are requesting from the government and from other institutions, from other organizations to provide us such facilities to facilitate the student, because education is oxygen for tomorrow. If we don't provide these facilities to the student, so the oxygen will be punished, and we will die.
Many governments are rife with corruption and also mean that this diverts resources and funding away from education.
Corruption and lack of good governance are related with poverty. and practically we are not poor in Africa or in Somalia, but lack of technology, lack of education, secular education are hindering the development and the reconstruction of Somalia.
Yet no matter the conditions in which people live, teachers are making an effort to try and provide some form of schooling for children.
Every child in Nigeria deserves education wherever they are. We are on water. That doesn't mean that we can't go to school on water. We have to. We need more schools to accommodate thousands of children that are at home.
What is clear is that for most developed countries across the globe, education has now become an expectation and almost an expected right. Yet for others, be it through lack of funding, government corruption, and of course the exploitation of resources by rich nations, education is nothing more than a dream. The consequences of a lack of simple education not only mean that countries remain in a status quo, but potentially we're losing out on a talented academic pool, left untouched by a cruel and economic educational divide.
To address education inequality, governments must invest heavily in child and youth development. Those are very important through appropriate education and health policies and programs. The higher quality education improves the distribution of skilled workers. This can help build a fairer society in which all people, rich or poor, have equal opportunities. As it is now, only the elites benefit from quality education. Still not convinced that there is a shocking divide in education? Consider this. Across the developing world, a child from a poor family is 7 times less likely to finish secondary school than a child from a rich family.
The painful truth is that without money, education is struggling to be a right to all people across the globe. Many of us sat around the world, enjoying our careers, watching TV, surfing the internet and travelling, never give a second thought as to the privileged positions many of us are in. Yet for many around the world, access to education is simply not affordable for a variety of reasons, and hence why we're seeing non-state actors contributing to education. During the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, the American billionaire George Soros pledged $1 billion in funds to set up accessible higher education to those who need it the most in the poorer countries. Non-state actors play a huge role in spreading the benefits of education, yet should it really be down to the generosity of others, or should governments take more responsibility? Yet the gap in funding does not affect the students and pupils of the world who want access to education. Those who are in positions of teaching are also being underpaid, and in some cases not receiving a fair pay for the work they do. Even in developed nations, the UK is currently seeing continuing strike action from university lecturers over this very issue. Some teachers have to take on second jobs in order to make ends meet.
What are you doing? I am working my second job. I'm putting out a for sale sign on a house. When teaching becomes too much of a job for me instead of having fun and being around the kids, that's when I'll get out. And it's becoming more of a job the longer that we have these budget cuts.
Those that are lucky enough to have an education, graduate and seek a future in the big wide world are themselves being left with crippling debts.
The average debt for a student is £44,000. I don't want to be in £44,000 of debt. I don't want other generations to be in £44,000 of debt. That's a lot of debt and it's bad on the taxpayer. They'll never pay it back, so it's a bad system.
We cannot go on with these levels of regional disparity. We cannot go on with the underfunding of so many of our public services, and we cannot go on loading every generation with debts of £50,000 or £60,000, which at some point it's going to get so serious there will be a shortage of people to go to university because they simply can't countenance the idea of that level of debt. The result is we all lose.
Joining us in the studio now is Mahan Abedin. He is our current affairs and impact analyst. Mahan, welcome. This particular story caught our attention here because the stats are pretty wild from what it's saying, that rich people have profited enough. A new poll shows 2/3 of Americans support wealth tax to combat inequality. Common Dreams ran this ad. What's your reaction when you hear this?
Oh, well, it's interesting, but what's more interesting, I think, is that sentiments like that very rarely translate themselves into political reality in the US. Because if that really was their sentiment, you'd think they'd all be for Bernie Sanders, who, you know, is the so-called socialist candidate in the upcoming elections. So I don't really know what to make of that. Is it just a fleeting feeling they have? Because if it was a well-established thing, they'd be voting for socialist candidates, wouldn't they? Or for people who are trying to correct the current situation.
Moving on to oil, again, oil prices are just going crazy in terms of the fluctuations. Yeah. But I'd like to focus, since we covered this somewhat in the last program,
yes.
I'd like to look at the way that this is going to affect, I'm not too sure, maybe you can tell us whether the oil price is going to affect global growth, or is global growth that this particular headline says is decreasing will then affect the demand for oil?
Yeah, well, I think right now everything is in flux in terms of what's happening with the coronavirus. I think the outlook, the economic outlook, is very grim, at least for the next quarter. So, but I think looking longer term in terms of oil prices, I think demand is going to go higher, so perhaps the prices will stabilize then.
Really?
Yeah.
Demand will go higher?
Well, I think there will be greater demand once we're over this crisis with the coronavirus, once we've, you know...
IMF had, however, said that it's going to be there's going to be a decrease of about 1.2% global growth cumulatively, down from 3.4, I believe.
Yeah.
But you think the demand is going to go?
Well, I think, you know, once we're over this, and I mean, you had this row between the Saudis and the Russians,
right?
In terms of, you know,
Still
production levels. Absolutely, yeah. I think looking ahead longer term, I think demand will go up. You know, interesting to see who fills that gap. Will it be the Saudis again who step up to fill the void? But yeah.
Very well. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for your input.
You're welcome.
Mon Abedin there. Okay, time for a quick break. Coming up, a closer look at whether education and money are so linked that it invites corruption at schools, particularly Ivy League schools in the U.S., where the corruption scandal linked to celebrities and Hollywood movie stars rocked that country. Also look at how elitist schools and universities in the UK are discriminating against both class and race, and see that many of the top jobs in the country go to so-called old boys club members. Also look at gender inequality throughout the world, as well as race inequality, with some schools in the U.S. taking drastic measures in order to maintain uniform discipline. We're also going to be joined by Roanna Brewer, mother of an autistic child in the UK, who struggled to get her child the education that he needs, and has taken the government on in a legal battle. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
In this edition of the Subcontinent, we will be reviewing the risky economic situation of Pakistan to see what the future holds for this country with immense potential. And we shall also look into the economic miracle of Bangladesh to see how the country radically transformed itself as the fastest growing economy in Asia.
Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kavita Ahway. This week we're looking at education inequality around the globe. Joining me in the studio is Roanna Brewer from Eastbourne in the UK. Roanna has been fighting a long battle against the UK education authorities in order to send her child to a school that can provide an education and cater for the needs that he has. Roanna, thanks for joining us today here on Economic Divide.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Roanna, tell us the experience that you had, which is particular in terms of the situation that you had your son in.
Well, I have a child with a diagnosis of autism and dyspraxia, and so I first started in campaigning from a personal point of view because it became quickly apparent that in order to secure any provision from our authority, I would have to file 3 appeals. So in effect, I had to go to court for a tribunal with my local authority 3 times in order to secure appropriate care and provision quantified and specified with a school place. So obviously that's taken a long time, and he's been out of school some years for it. We are now in a situation where we also struggle to access services through the NHS due to crumbling resources, a lack of funding and austerity cuts that have basically hit the community, the disability community across the board.
Well, clearly you're not alone in the UK in dealing with this issue. I would imagine. I mean, why is the UK government not doing enough for children with learning difficulties, disabilities, special needs, or other problems?
We would think so. However, what became very apparent to me is the law and the government do not go hand in hand. So where we have the equality rights that promises us access to provision and certain basic entitlements that a neurotypical child or a child without additional needs would access, we do not have that readily available to us. And the reason for this, from my perspective, is the continued cuts to funding that has severely affected not only our SEND children, but also adults, also early years provision, also the post-16, where children go after the traditional leaving dates and into work opportunities, how they then are able to fit into a community. It's all made incredibly difficult by these continued austerity cuts. We're told now that they're rather generously giving a drop into the ocean, but we have yet to see those funds cascade to the ground, and we have yet to see any promise on how the UK government will be held to account for.
Well, clearly, for some of the viewers watching this, Rana, maybe you can tell us who are in the same position as you, what they can do, what advice you have for them to help their children get the education that they deserve.
When it comes to special education needs, especially in the UK, you can never know enough. And unfortunately, you are your parents, your child's advocate. It will be up to you to know the law and to apply the law, because at each juncture there will be a hurdle to accessing these provisions. So I would very much point them in the direction of our movement to lobby for change, which would be sent a national crisis. We handed in 20,000 signatures to government last year, and we are lobbying hard and fast for extra rights for carers and to make sure that these funding proposals, which are simply a drop in the ocean, do actually cascade to where they're needed in a lawful manner with accountability.
Very well. Thank you very much for that. That's Rana Brewer that you're listening to.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Rana Brewer there from Eastbourne in the UK. Obviously, her battle is against what she has deemed to be inadequate government response, and in her case, in the special needs that her son had. We thank Rana for joining us for this edition.
When the Incas were building stone cities in the Andes, Oxford University in the UK had already been established for some time, with many great thinkers passing through the academic ranks. Yet privilege is something that doesn't come for free in the UK. Graduates from Oxford and Cambridge go on to some very important roles, yet there's a clear favouritism at Oxbridge, with allegations that undergraduates are being accepted into schools not based on their educational achievements, but on their ancestry and postcodes.
But you can't blame students and families for going for the most prestigious schools and colleges and universities. What we're saying is, what should the government be doing? You know, I don't blame parents or students for wanting to follow these fashions. It's just a consequence of, because some of the universities are older, and it is basically the older ones that are more prestigious and the newer ones are less prestigious. There's a history to them. So places like Durham, where I am, was from the 19th century, and then you've got the sort of 14th century Oxford, Cambridge colleges tend to be more prestigious. Therefore, more people apply. Therefore, they can ask for a higher tariff for entry, and therefore they're seen as better because they get, apparently, more talented students.
Of the 57 prime ministers in the UK, 43 of them went to Oxbridge universities, 11 had no university education, and only 3 went to other academic institutions.
What we should be doing is looking to see to what extent people with equivalent qualifications or equivalent attributes do well under one system or another. And when I say equivalent, what I mean by that is you can't just use things like prior qualifications, because somebody who struggled in their life, maybe had to look after younger siblings because they're from a one-parent family, may have grades that are a touch lower than a student from another family who hasn't been struggling. And the potential of the first student may be greater.
Take the level down to schooling, and the privileged also enjoy the likes of Eton, Harrow and other public schools, many of which see fees in excess of £42,000 per year. That's almost double the national average wage. Are then certain classes being favoured when it comes to school and university? The notion is reflected across the pond. with 16 of the 45 US presidents having attended Ivy League schools, again showing that education in elite institutions can lead to positions that others may not necessarily be privileged to. The US has recently seen multiple scandals where the rich have lied, bought and cheated their way into the best colleges in the country, again demonstrating that the root of all evil is money, greed and social class.
Our focus in the in-depth section is on education inequality in the U.S. Now we're going to take a look at two factors here. First, the top universities in the U.S., namely Harvard, Princeton, and MIT, and students from which states were accepted in those private universities. This is what our findings showed. Our findings looked at this attendance between the years 2015 to 2017. Well, 4 Connecticut schools, all private, cracked the top 50. There were Choate Rosemary Hall, which sent 27 students to these 3 institutions during that period. Then the Hotchkiss School, which sent 23 students. Hopkins School came next with 21 students, and Greenwich Academy with 18 students. What is significant about these findings, for starters, these schools are all private schools. Here's how much the tuition is for Choate Rosemary Hall, for example, $60,000 per year. That's even higher than the university like Harvard, which is $53,000 per year. And when it comes to race at these private schools compared to public schools, private schools are more likely than public schools to be virtually all white, defined as a school where 90% or more of the students are white.
Money, although a major factor in the ability to ascertain and provide a quality education, is not the only problem facing students around the world. We already know that social class is a major contributor, but also in the shadows of the academic world lays other discriminatory issues, namely race and sex. When Malala Yousafzai was shot for allegedly demanding education rights for women, little did she know that one day she would go on to be a voice for equal rights for girls in the education system.
We invest in girls today. A future beyond our imagining is possible. As the host of this year's G20, Prime Minister Abe and Japan have the opportunity to lead on girls' education. I cannot think of a better legacy for this year's summit or a better gift for Japan to give to the world than girls' education.
Whereas many boys in developing countries are forced into labour in order to feed their families, in some nations, girls having an education is simply considered unnecessary, as they're simply expected to run homes instead of achieving their academic dreams. Race is also a major issue in the world of education, with one child in the US, for example, being discriminated against due to the colour of his skin and the type of his hair. So extreme was the racism that he was pinned down and had his scalp coloured with a black marker.
We are here today with the parents, with members of the community, because we are not going to stand for systemic racism at the Pearland Independent School District. Kids should not be subjected to adults grabbing them and coloring in their hair or their scalp with permanent magic markers. That's assault.
Furthermore, certain communities across the world are discriminated against simply because of their lifestyle. The traveller community in Europe has long been targeted as a minority group, and in the UK alone, 60% of travellers have no formal education.
60% of the parents of these children said that the children don't go to school because they were refused enrollment or they were put on a waiting list for public school. And when I say waiting list, it's a waiting list that doesn't exist.
Aside from race, colour, religion and gender, some children are also suffering from devastating attacks of bullying, as demonstrated in the heartbreaking story of Quaden Bales in Australia, intimidated by his fellow students due to his disability.
What do you want to do right now? I want to bang my head into a club. I want someone to kill me and you have me.
And this is the impact bullying has.
It seems that when one is privileged enough to have access to an education, sometimes all cards are stacked against children enjoying what are supposed to be the best days of their lives.
Governments have an obligation to invest in their education systems, whereas some set aside budgets for education, from infrastructure to the quality of the teaching system. Others fail to address their education challenges. I mean, if NATO member countries are expected to pay 2% of their GDP to the alliance, why don't the member countries then give the same importance to education in their budget? This could lead to education equality. And that's it for another edition of Economic Divide. If you would like to share a story with us about the issues that you find important, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us using the hashtag #ED_program. Our contact details are on your screens now. I've been your host, Kavitatwe, and on behalf of myself and the whole team here on the show, thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.